Gaeler in Gabriel Shiesto 15 fóidir Gaeler go big Áras an Uachtaráin agus tá áfas ar an hyn is ar madan céile saithín go bhfuil sib in ár golúda agus caithame rá goma go agad sin fíorsásaibh dúin lá internaisiúnta na mám in cíliúr inniu. Líbse atá go sáte sin in éagar sé súile chun cúnamh práictiúr agus tátaíocht chábhachtach a bhúta Maná Toidir God Lesh. May I say how welcome you all are to Áras and Uachtaráin, and Sabine and I are so pleased to be celebrating International Women's Day with all of you. Activists, tireless campaigners, volunteers and staff of organisations that play such a vital role in empowering the women of this country to live dignified and meaningful lives. Lives free from fear, from terror, from abuse, lives enabled to develop and flourish to their fullest potential. And we were just saying, every single one of you, how important you are, not just to the lives of women, but to citizenship itself in this country. Of course, as we meet for International Women's Day 2017, there are dark shadows that hang over our meeting, shadows that require us all to summon up yet again a light that might dispel the darkness to which so many women and their children were condemned, and the questions that were left unanswered as life moved on. We must accept, all of us, that all of society loses when gender inequality is not only allowed to occur, but is allowed to reproduce itself. This happens when a silence prevails where it should have been broken. The recent horrifying revelations of a mass grave of babies in Tuam, discovered as a result of the relentless work of local historian Catherine Corliss, often impeded, rarely assisted, is another necessary step in blowing open the locked doors of a hidden island, and we are challenged to consider how the reprehensible attitudes that were held towards what were called unmarried women and so-called illegitimate babies came to be held, and with what consequences for so long and by so many. May I commend the work of Catherine Corliss and others who have continued to ask the questions that are important if we are to face the truth of what prevailed and ensure the rightful question put by women who had direct experience of institutions and the society they reflected, and their relatives too. They will have questions that simply cannot be ignored in a democracy. So many questions remain, and I hope that the Commission of Inquiry will serve to put the truth on the record in a way that respects the memory of these children, their families, and their mothers in particular. I also want to welcome the government's decision to set up a commission of investigation to examine the alleged abuse of an intellectually disabled young woman known as Grace at a foster home in the southeast, and to be open to the extension of that investigation. I do also want to express my sympathy to all those affected by the tragedy in Clondalkin. The women involved would have been represented here today, and all our hearts must go out to these women and children. And indeed, I want to say something as well. I think our hearts must go out to the women and children who are in what is called direct provision in Ireland. And I want to welcome the acknowledgement of the ethnic status for travellers. It's just a fact that Sabine and I are very familiar with the particular burden that was carried, be it in relation to housing, be it in relation to health, be it in relation to hard stamps, temporary and permanent, that were carried by women in the travelling community, and how often they visited our house at different times in circumstances that still make me angry when I look back at how they were treated. We We've decided today to place the emphasis on this International Women's Day reception at the Áras on the topic of domestic violence. Domestic violence is an outright negation of the dignity and rights of women. Our collective journey towards the full enjoyment of women's rights will never be complete if those abuses of the gravest sort are tolerated, and more importantly, if the silence is allowed to prevail around. That is why I'm so delighted to have the opportunity on this very special day in the international calendar to pay tribute to so many organisations, groups and individuals from all parts of Ireland as you have come today, who are committed to speaking up against domestic violence and to supporting women in breaking free from the cycle of anguish that it creates. Now, while we must acknowledge that men also can be victims of similar crimes perpetrated by women or by other men, and their suffering and need for support is no less on a rights basis. However, it is clear that the perpetrators are predominantly men and the victims predominantly women. It is fitting, therefore, to acknowledge this issue on International Women's Day, and it is indeed appropriate to celebrate your efforts and the contribution that you are making to the lives of so many. All of you organisations and individuals are a vital support a vital source of support for the women and their children whose lives are scarred by violence, who have so often suffered at the hands of somebody to whom they're intimately related, that being one of the most appalling facts of abuse. The daily work conducted by your staff and volunteers, the practical and emotional support you provide to women in distress are vital. Every phone call picked up on your helpline, every face-to-face conversation with a distraught woman, every day spent in the safe haven of a refuge contributes to breaking the spiral of abuse, to cracking the cage of isolation and hopelessness in which the victims of domestic violence so often live. And I do recall how it was necessary in the evolution of this state so often for voluntary initiatives to have to be established first so as to demonstrate to the state the basic need of that was there. So may I then thank each and every one of you who are here this afternoon for your dedication to supporting women in their efforts to reconstruct fulfilling lives for themselves and their children. Lives, as I have described it, free from fear. And your work is a huge social work. It is work that contributes to uprooting forms of abuse that stand in the way of the Ireland we so dearly wish to achieve, not just for this, but for future generations, for the women and also for the men of today, and for their daughters and sons, and for their grandchildren. And as I pass, may I say, I am so pleased that people here from different backgrounds and different cultures. But I want to repeat something I have said at the United Nations, and I have said internationally again and again. There is never a cultural justification for any discrimination or abuse against a woman. And it must never be... Dear friends, the steady increase in the number of women held by your organisations gives us a lesson that has two sides. On the one hand, it indicates that violence inside the home is progressively getting the level of public recognition it deserves, that women are more willing to come forward and seek support, and that is a good thing. Yet on the other hand, the number of incidents recorded each year in Ireland, counted by the thousands, also attests to the alarming persistence of domestic violence in our country. It has to stop. In a 2014 study entitled Violence Against Women, a European Union-wide survey, the European Union's Fundamental Rights Agency reported that 14% of women in Ireland have experienced physical violence by a partner since the age of 15, and that more than a third have experienced psychological violence. Sexual violence by a partner or former partner, as well as stalking, including cyber stalking, are further matters for concern. An earlier research conducted by the National Crime Council and the Economic and Social Research Institute had arrived at similar conclusions, finding that 1 in 7 women in our country have at some time in their lives experienced severe abuse of a physical, sexual or emotional nature at the hands of a partner or husband. That is not, of course, a uniquely Irish phenomenon. The European Union campaign against domestic violence has shown that 25% of all violent crimes reported in the European Union involve a man assaulting his wife or partner. Such figures are all the more alarming as domestic violence is an especially pernicious form of violence, and one that has a higher rate of occurrence than any other type of crime. Moreover, as you know very well, the poison of domestic violence is one that extends beyond the aggressor and the direct victim. It seeps into every aspect of family life, into the hearts and minds of children who witness it, who grow up in the shadow of fear, and often develop a skewed perspective on human relations. And indeed, as a sociologist by training, it is one of the most significant sociological findings that this is a learned behaviour. So therefore it took a very long time for people to remove the prejudice from their thinking and their research that assumed it was significantly located in one particular class. It is in all classes, and unfortunately, physical, emotional, and even sexual aggression is a learned behaviour that can contaminate the relationships of those who witness such abuse in their own childhoods and victimize another generation of women and children. And thus our responsibility, and I say it as President of Ireland, as a society and individually, as concerned citizens, is to use all the means at our disposal, not just to curb, but to end this cycle of destructive violence. And in that regard, the advocacy activities and awareness-raising campaigns carried out by some of your organisations are just so important. They play a central role in galvanising the transformative change that we need, not just through their contribution to the reinforcement of our legislative and criminal justice systems' response to domestic violence, but also through a range of initiatives aimed at fostering a change of consciousness among the wider Irish population, including and most crucially, among our male population. Indeed, the cause of women's rights and equality is a political project in which men should have a great interest and have as an onerous a duty as women. An important step in uprooting the misplaced feelings of superiority that so often underpin male violence towards women. And remember, all the studies show that it is in the end an attempt at domination. I believe the nurturing of an atmosphere that will enable men to feel comfortable and empowered, to identify themselves as champions of women's rights. Men must be engaged, and many are becoming so, to be vocal about their intolerance of such physical, psychological and sexual aggression against women. This is a step I consciously took when I accepted in February 2015 the invitation of Mzila Mlambo Nguka, Executive Director of the United Nations Women's Agency, to take part in the He for She campaign. In taking up this role along with several other heads of state and government, I committed to using the influence of my office to convey a simple but essential message that men must stand up and show leadership if women's rights are to be fully achieved. And in March of last year, Sabine and I had the pleasure of organising a special event here in the Áras in partnership with Save Ireland's Man Up campaign. A campaign which engaged men and boys to stand up and play their part in ending gender-based violence, and more broadly, to fostering positive change within their communities and organisations. It is also encouraging to see the success of similar initiatives, such as the White Ribbon campaign, which has been such a successful global, male-led movement to end men's violence against women. And that has been notably supported by Tom Maher, the husband of Jill Maher, who was so shockingly murdered in Melbourne in 2012. Such a deep-seated change of consciousness is all the more necessary as we are witnessing across the world an upsurge of intolerable forms of violence against women and girls, including trafficking and sexual exploitation. We know, for example, that one of the most alarming dimensions in the plight of those hundreds of thousands of refugees who currently find themselves trapped at the gates of Europe is the extreme vulnerability of women and children to exploitation and violence. I have stated before, but it is worth repeating again today. Gender-based violence is a universal outrage rooted in many factors, including poverty, conflict, and vulnerable position of women in accessing credit and land ownership. In the heat of the sun in so many countries in Africa, tilling the land and owning nothing. And development organisations have to recognise this, that any suggestions of change and development must put the rights of women at the top. And the Irish is in fact doing this. While some achievements have been made, violence and coercion are increasing at global levels, in particular in zones of conflict, displacement and transit. The eradication of gender-based violence remains a great ethical, and it is one of the great global challenges of our age. At this moment, rape continues to be persistently used as a weapon of war. I recently received a visit from a young Yazidi woman, Nadia Murad Basitaha, who was looking for a safe zone and who described the harrowing sufferings of so many women and girls from that small and ancient people who are being used as sex slaves by those who derive from their distorted reading of the sacred texts. And it is a distorted reading. It has no basis in the sacred text, but in it they seek a license to treat women as inferior beings. And as all of you here know very well, however, the discourses and attitudes suggesting female inferiority and fueling prejudice towards women are far from being the preserve of any singular culture or religion. Indeed, today we're witnessing a worrying surge of unapologetic sexism and the undermining of women's rights in one of the world's most advanced democracies, and the use of language which would be unacceptable in people who accept the equality of women. This reminds us that no society is immune to such harmful regressions of rights painstakingly won. And let us remind ourselves again, and in this country too, that rights did not drop from the sky. They are the result of a struggle. We must never let down our guard, rest on any laurels, and we must confront not just violence, but the prejudice and disrespect wherever it arises. It is important in such a context that our own government has in 2015 signed the Council of Europe Convention on Preventing and Combating Violence Against Women and Domestic Violence, and it will hopefully move towards full ratification soon. In striving to eliminate gender-based violence, we are very fortunate indeed to be able to rely then on the dedication, professionalism, and simply utter determination of so many groups like yourselves who defend the rights of women across Ireland. So, may I say once again, it's Cóirí de Uachtaráin, how pleased I am to be able to convey to you my deepest appreciation and most heartfelt thanks for the crucial mission you so diligently carry out day after day. It is thanks to your solidarity, understanding and support that women who are vulnerable to domestic and other forms of violence may find it easier to articulate their ordeal, to reflect on it, and to eventually emancipate themselves from its destructive influence on their lives and their children. You encourage them to face, but also transform, transact and transform their suffering, thereby paving the way for a future where hope and meaning can be restored. An Lásha is muide Calura, is few Calura ya. Calura de or nirachti, or nikrishak or gorquig, can cahrum the fane with the mark, the monota muera, agus the knap bang elia mare. Calura kama, den fishetain, suckly with the mark and will gakenia, and an mara kalidina, gan wagat, agus le firvasak in Ilya Arikela. Today is a day of celebration, a celebration of what is possible, and rather favour, and celebration of a new relationship between men and women, forged by those like yourself who are contributing your transformative energy, your sense of justice, and the power that you have of care in our society. And as Sabina and I looked around this room and met you all on the receiving line, it was so heartening to see so many people committed to combating distress and despair. May we wish you every success with your important work and continued courage in your future endeavours. Ganaili lipsum taaki, Barbana, this Garamina Mahakitale.